At 6:18 hours on the 23rd of March, 1944, in a shallow ravine south of the village of Velika Nepetika, on the right bank of the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine, a single M4A2 Sherman lay tilted nose down in liquid brown mud, its engine idling unevenly, its exhaust coughing blue smoke into the cold morning air. 300 meters away, partially concealed behind a hedgerow and the collapsed wall of a collective farm, the silhouettes of 3 German Panzer IV tanks waited in silence, guns already trained on the trapped vehicle. Inside the Sherman, the assistant driver had his gloved hands buried in the engine compartment, smearing wet earth into exposed metal parts as the tank commander whispered for him to stop. One wrong move, one spark, one seized bearing, and the Sherman would be immobile forever. The German tanks would fire within minutes. And yet the mechanic continued, ignoring shouted orders, forcing thick mud into places no regulation manual would ever allow. Years later, surviving crewmen would say the same thing. At that moment, none of them understood how the tank survived. The question would remain unanswered in official reports. How did it come to this? By the spring of 1944, the southern sector of the Eastern Front was grinding forward under the full weight of the Red Army's winter victories.
After the destruction of German forces west of the Dnipro and the liberation of Kherson, Soviet armored formations were ordered to push relentlessly toward Mykolaiv and the approaches to Odessa. The terrain was deceptive. From a distance, the steppe appeared open and forgiving, but the seasonal thaw had transformed every field, ravine, and dirt road into a trap. Rasputitsa had returned. The frozen earth released its grip, and the ground became a sucking mass of clay and water capable of swallowing trucks, guns, and tanks whole. The 1st Guards Tank Army, reconstituted and reinforced after the winter fighting, was tasked with exploiting breakthroughs created by infantry and artillery formations. Its orders were explicit: advance aggressively, bypass strongpoints, disrupt German withdrawal routes, and prevent the enemy from stabilizing a defensive line along the southern bug. Fuel shortages, overextended supply columns, and exhausted crews were accepted as unavoidable costs. The expectation was movement at any price. German forces in the sector belonged primarily to elements of the 6th Army, attempting to delay the Soviet advance through mobile defense. Panzer Grenadier battalions, reinforced by remaining armored assets, were instructed to conduct ambushes, counterattacks, and fighting withdrawals. Anti-tank guns were dug in along likely approaches, often covering muddy low ground where Soviet armor would be forced to slow or funnel into predictable paths.
German commanders understood the terrain well. They intended to let the mud do half the work. On the night of the 22nd of March, a forward detachment from the 1st Guards Tank Army was ordered to probe south of Velika Nepetika to identify German positions near a series of irrigation canals feeding into the Dnipro floodplain. The detachment included 3 M4A2 Sherman tanks received under Lend-Lease the previous autumn. These diesel-powered vehicles had proven reliable in winter conditions compared to gasoline-powered models, but they were not immune to the demands of the Ukrainian spring. Their weight, combined with wide tracks optimized for snow rather than mud, made them vulnerable in thawing ground. One of these tanks carried aboard Senior Sergeant Ivan Stepanovich Morozov, aged 27, assistant driver and mechanic. Morozov had been assigned to armored units since 1942, first working on damaged T-34s near Voronezh, before being transferred to a guards formation and retrained on foreign equipment. Born in a small village outside Tula, he had worked as a machine fitter in a tractor repair workshop before the war. He spoke little, slept poorly, and carried a permanent burn scar along his left forearm from an engine fire during the winter fighting near Kharkov. Those who served with him described him as methodical, stubborn, and unnervingly calm under pressure. He trusted metal more than men. Morozov had not liked the Sherman.
He respected its engine and appreciated the diesel fuel, which was less prone to ignition under fire. But he distrusted its electrical system and despised the fan belt assembly, which he believed was too exposed for frontline conditions. He had already replaced one snapped belt 2 weeks earlier, using a shortened section scavenged from a destroyed Studebaker truck. Regulations forbade such improvisation, but no replacement parts were available. Shortly after 0540 hours, Morozov's tank left the dirt road and attempted to skirt a flooded field in order to reach a line of trees overlooking the canal. The ground appeared firm, crusted over from the night frost. The driver advanced at low speed, second gear, engine steady. At 20 meters in, the crust broke. The right track sank first, then the left, and within seconds the tank settled belly deep into the mud. The engine labored as the driver attempted to reverse, then surged as the track spun uselessly, flinging heavy clay against the hull. Morozov felt the vibration change immediately. He ordered the driver to stop. The engine was already overheating. Mud had packed into the drive sprockets, and the left track was beginning to bind. The cooling fan whined unevenly. Somewhere behind them, artillery rumbled. The radio crackled with fragmented reports of German movement. The tank commander ordered the driver to try again. Morozov refused.
He climbed down into the mud, boots sinking nearly to the knee, and inspected the suspension. Thick clay clung to every moving part. The idler wheel barely turned. Worse still, the mud had forced its way into the lower engine compartment vents. If the fan belt snapped now, or if the engine seized, the tank would be lost. As Morozov worked, the weather shifted. The thin morning frost vanished, replaced by cold drizzle that turned the mud slick and heavy. Visibility dropped. From the tree line ahead came the distant sound of tracked vehicles moving cautiously, stopping, then moving again. German engines. Panzer IVs used a distinctive rhythm at low speed, and Morozov had learned to recognize it. The tank commander demanded speed. Infantry support was nowhere in sight. The other two Shermans had halted on firmer ground and were unable to assist without risking the same fate. Morozov crawled back into the driver's compartment, soaked, shaking with cold, and listened to the engine. Oil pressure was fluctuating. The lubricant, thickened by the cold night and now contaminated with fine grit, was not circulating properly. If they shut the engine down, restarting it might be impossible. If they kept it running, it might tear itself apart. At 0602 hours, a German forward observer spotted the immobilized tank. Mortar rounds began to fall, first wide, then closer. One exploded 30 meters away, showering the Sherman with wet earth and shrapnel.
The commander called for immediate extraction or destruction of the vehicle. Morozov said nothing. He opened the engine access panel again and stared into the mess of belts, pipes, and wiring coated in mud and oil. It was then that he made a decision that no field manual endorsed and no officer would approve. He reached down into the mud pooled beneath the hull and began scooping it up by hand. Inside the tank, the crew watched in disbelief as Morozov forced wet clay into the exposed fan belt housing, around the lower pulleys, and along the engine mounts. He packed it deliberately, layer by layer, ignoring shouted warnings. His reasoning was simple, rooted in factory logic rather than battlefield doctrine. If the belt slipped, it would snap. If it overheated, it would fail. But if the mud cooled it, dampened vibration, and increased friction just enough, the belt might hold long enough to free the tracks. The risk was absolute. Mud inside the engine could cause catastrophic failure. It could ignite. It could seize the engine permanently.
But Morozov understood something the others did not yet grasp. The tank was already dead if they followed procedure. At 0611 hours, the 1st German Panzer IV moved into firing position. And Morozov was still packing mud into the engine. At 0613 hours, as Morozov tightened the last improvised fastening with fingers already numb and bleeding, the sound of German armor became unmistakable.
Through the periscope slit, the gunner saw the squared silhouette of a Panzer IV Ausf H edging forward from behind the ruined collective farm wall, its long-barreled 7.5-centimeter gun probing the fog like a finger searching for a pulse. The distance was no more than 300 meters. At that range, even a glancing hit could rip through the Sherman's side armor. The tank commander ordered Morozov back inside. He did not argue. He slammed the engine panel shut and dropped into his seat as another mortar round landed close enough to rock the hull. The driver eased the throttle forward. The engine responded unevenly, coughing once, then settling into a strained, low growl. The packed mud began to steam, moisture boiling off in thin, white strands that seeped through every seam. Oil pressure wavered but did not collapse. Morozov leaned forward, ear pressed close to the bulkhead, listening not to the gunfire outside, but to the rhythm of the machinery. The fan belt screamed, then steadied. The left track shuddered, grinding against the mud that clutched it like cement. Outside, German Panzer Grenadiers advanced cautiously, using shell craters and irrigation ditches for cover. They had learned to respect Soviet tanks, even when immobilized. A man with a Panzerfaust crept forward, hunched low, his movements careful and deliberate. The Sherman's coaxial machine gun opened fire, tracer rounds stitching the ground in front of him. He dropped flat, crawling backward into cover.
At 0:16 hours, the Panzer IV fired. The shell struck the ground short, exploding in a geyser of mud that hammered the Sherman's glacis and filled the air with debris. Inside the tank, the blast sounded like a massive hammer blow. Dust and mud filtered down onto the crew. The radio crackled with fragments of desperate traffic, reports of German armor, calls for artillery that could not respond in time. Morozov shouted for the driver to rock the tank, forward, then reverse, gently at first, then harder. The engine strained. The hull lurched, sinking another few centimeters before stopping dead. For a moment it seemed the mud had won. The fan belt shrieked again, louder now, but it did not snap. Steam poured from the engine compartment, fogging the interior until the crew could barely see each other's faces. A second Panzer IV appeared, moving to flank. Its commander clearly understood the situation. 2 tanks would hold the Sherman's attention while the infantry closed in. The 1st Panzer IV adjusted its aim, preparing for a killing shot. Then the left track moved. It was barely perceptible at first, a slow, reluctant turn that sent ripples through the mud. Morozov felt it through the floor plates before he saw it. He yelled for more power. The driver complied, pushing the throttle beyond what he would normally dare. The engine howled. The temperature gauge climbed into the red. Every instinct told Morozov the engine should already be tearing itself apart.
Instead, the packed mud did what he had hoped. It dampened the vibration, cooled the belt just enough, and increased grip where bare metal would have slipped. The track turned again, this time more decisively. The hull rocked forward, breaking free from the suction that had held it fast.
At 06:18 hours, the Sherman lurched forward in a spray of mud, climbing out of the ravine like a wounded animal finding its footing. The Panzer IV fired again, the shell passing just wide, tearing through the trees behind. The Sherman's gunner returned fire without waiting for orders. The first round struck the German tank's front plate and ricocheted, but the second hit lower, jamming the turret ring with shrapnel and forcing the Panzer IV to halt. The second German tank reversed, seeking a better angle. Panzer grenadiers scattered as the Sherman advanced, its tracks finally biting into firmer ground. The engine screamed in protest, steam and smoke pouring from every vent, but it kept running. Morozov watched the gauges with absolute focus. He knew they had minutes at best before the engine failed completely. The tank commander ordered a withdrawal toward the tree line, where the other Shermans were waiting. The driver complied, keeping speed just high enough to maintain momentum. Behind them, German fire intensified. Machine gun rounds rattled against the hull. A pack gun opened up from somewhere unseen, its shot striking the ground close enough to shower the tank with dirt and fragments.
At 06:22 hours, as the Sherman crossed into the trees, the fan belt finally began to fray. Morozov could hear it, a faint, irregular slapping beneath the roar of the engine. He shouted a warning. The commander ordered an immediate halt once they were under cover. The engine was cut. Silence fell, broken only by distant gunfire and the ticking of hot metal cooling. The crew sat motionless, listening. The belt snapped a moment later with a bell final sound. German forces did not pursue. Their tanks remained at range, wary of a trap, and already under threat from Soviet artillery beginning to adjust its fire. Within an hour, engineers arrived with towing cables and support vehicles. The Sherman was recovered, its engine ruined but its crew alive. Morozov said nothing as officers argued over what had happened. There was no regulation to explain it, no proper report to file. In the logbook, the incident would be reduced to a single line: vehicle temporarily immobilized by mud, recovered under fire. But those who were there would remember the steam, the mud, and the sound of an engine that should not have survived. By midday on the 23rd of March, the rain had thickened into a steady curtain that flattened the steppe and turned every movement into labor. The recovered Sherman was hauled behind the tree line and left under camouflage netting while the rest of the detachment pressed on with the advance.
Morozov remained with the disabled tank, tools laid out on a tarp, darkened by oil and rainwater. The engine compartment was a ruin. Mud had baked onto hot metal. Wiring insulation had blistered, and the fan belt lay in two shredded lengths at the bottom of the housing. According to regulations, the power plant should have been written off on the spot. Yet when Morozov began dismantling the components, he found something unexpected. The bearings had not seized. The crankshaft turned freely by hand. The mud he had packed in had not infiltrated the deepest parts of the engine as feared. Instead, it had formed a crude insulating layer, absorbing heat and vibration long enough for the tracks to break free. It was a reckless solution, but not a foolish one. That evening, the tank battalion commander arrived to inspect the vehicle. He listened in silence as Morozov explained what he had done, using the language of a factory fitter rather than a soldier. There was no praise. There was also no punishment. The commander understood the reality of the situation. Replacement engines were scarce. Crews were irreplaceable. Survival often depended on acts that could not be sanctioned in writing. The next morning,
The German response became clear. Panzer Grenadier units attempted to counterattack along the same axis, supported by two Stug 3 assault guns operating from hull-down positions near the canal. Their fire caught one of the other Shermans, disabling it with a hit to the drive sprocket.
Again, recovery under fire became necessary. Again, Morozov was called forward. This time, there was no dramatic improvisation. The ground had firmed slightly overnight, and the damaged tank was extracted using cables and coordinated engine power. But among the mechanics and drivers, a quiet understanding had formed. Procedures were guidelines, not absolutes. The environment dictated its own rules. Over the following weeks, the advance continued westward. Rasputitsa loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly. Tanks broke down as often from mechanical fatigue as from enemy fire. In unofficial conversations, Morozov's name began to circulate among crews, not as a hero, but as someone who understood machines in a way others did not. He was asked for advice. He offered it sparingly. He warned against imitation without understanding. Mud in the wrong place could kill a tank as surely as a shell. In April, as the army approached the outskirts of Mykolaiv, Morozov's Sherman returned to limited service with a replacement belt and rewired electrical system. The engine never fully recovered. Oil consumption remained high, power output was uneven, but it ran, and in 1944 that was often enough. There is no record of Morozov receiving an award for his actions on the 23rd of March. The engagement itself faded into the mass of daily fighting that defined the Southern Front.
German war diaries mention a delayed counterattack near Velika Lepetica, citing unexpected Soviet armored mobility despite terrain conditions. No explanation is offered. After the war, Morozov returned to civilian life. He worked again in a repair workshop. He described engines, tolerances, heat, and friction. When asked about the incident with the Sherman, he paused, then said only that machines behave differently when forced beyond their intended limits. The tank itself did not survive the war. It was lost during the fighting near the Dniester later that summer, destroyed by artillery. The crew survived. Today, the story exists only in fragments, a line in a maintenance log, a passing mention in a German report, the memories of men long gone. Whether Morozov's mud trick was ever repeated deliberately is impossible to say. Official doctrine never acknowledged it. Manuals remained unchanged. What is certain is this: on a wet March morning in southern Ukraine, under the guns of 3 German tanks, a mechanic chose to trust his understanding of metal and motion over written orders. For a few crucial minutes, it was enough. In the years immediately following the war, no formal inquiry was ever conducted in the incident near Velika Lepetica.
The Red Army had little interest in isolating single acts of improvisation when entire fronts had survived through similar decisions made under fire. Archives filled with reports of tanks abandoned, engines burned out, transmissions destroyed by overuse. Against that background, one Sherman escaping a mud trap under enemy guns was insignificant. Yet among those who had been present, the memory hardened rather than faded. Former crewmen would later recall the sound the engine made in those minutes after breaking free, a strained, uneven roar that did not belong to a healthy machine, but also did not belong to one that was dying. It was the sound of something being held together by force of will and circumstance. They remembered the smell most of all: hot oil, wet earth, scorched rubber, and the sharp metallic tang of overheated steel. None of it appeared in official records. Post-war technical reviews of Lend-Lease equipment conducted in 1946 noted that the M4A2's diesel engine performed acceptably in cold conditions, but was insufficiently protected against contamination during extreme terrain operations. The report recommended improved sealing and revised maintenance procedures,
No mention was made of mud, improvised cooling, or battlefield modifications. Doctrine preferred clean conclusions. Morozov himself never attempted to formalize what he had done.
When asked by younger mechanics in the workshop how a machine could survive such abuse, he would answer indirectly, speaking instead about tolerances, margins, and the difference between theoretical failure and actual failure. He insisted that every engine carried hidden reserves, limits unknown even to its designers, but that discovering them without killing the machine required instinct, not recklessness. In the late 1960s, as veterans' testimonies were quietly collected by regional museums, Morozov's name surfaced once more. His account was brief and unadorned. He described the mud as cold and heavy, the engine as already half lost, the choice as obvious. He rejected the idea that it was clever. There was no other way, he said. If it failed, we died. If it worked, we lived. That is not invention, that is necessity. He died in 1974, long before historians began re-examining the technical realities of the Eastern Front with fresh eyes. When later researchers compared Soviet and German armored losses during Rasputitsa periods, they noted a recurring pattern. Vehicles that should have been immobilized sometimes escaped, while others failed inexplicably. Environmental adaptation, they concluded, played a larger role than manuals acknowledged. The Sherman crew dispersed after the war. One became a bus driver, another a lathe operator, another vanished into the vast civilian workforce without trace. None spoke publicly about medals or heroism.
When asked about survival, they spoke of mechanics. Today, near the site where the incident occurred, the land shows no sign of what happened. The ravine has softened, the fields leveled by decades of farming. No markers stand where 3 Panzer IVs once waited, and a single immobilized tank should have been destroyed. The mud that nearly consumed the Sherman dries and cracks in summer, freezes solid in winter, indifferent to memory. What remains is an unanswered question that appears again and again in the study of the Eastern Front. How many machines survived not because they were designed to, but because someone understood them well enough to break every rule at exactly the right moment? The answer, like so many from that war, lies buried not in archives, but in the space between doctrine and desperation, where survival was engineered by hands working in the mud, under fire, with no witnesses left to argue whether it should have been possible at all.